The air at Firebase Alpha was a suffocating shroud, a living, breathing entity woven from heat, humidity, and the pervasive scent of rot and fear. Private First Class Billy Rook Caldwell, barely out of basic, felt it pressed down on him like a physical weight, heavier than his rucksack, more suffocating than the triple canopy jungle that ringed their makeshift perimeter. He sat on a makeshift stool carved from an ammo crate, his M16 disassembled across a grimy poncho liner, meticulously cleaning parts that were already spotless. It was his 10th pass over the bolt carrier group in an hour. His eyes, though fixed on the dull metal, saw nothing but the shimmering heat waves rising from the sun-baked sandbags and the endless, inscrutable green beyond the wire. Sergeant Elias Vance, a man whose skin had the leathery, sun-beaten quality of an old saddle, watched Rook from a distance. Elias sat cross-legged, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his gaze sweeping the tree line with an unnerving calm. He'd seen countless Rooks come and go, fresh-faced and eager, slowly ground down by the relentless, unseen war, the war of waiting. It was a war fought not with bullets and grenades, but with time, with a gnawing uncertainty that ate at a man's soul, leaving him hollow. The distant, rhythmic thud of artillery fire from another sector was the jungle's heartbeat, a constant, low growl that served as a grim reminder of their proximity to something terrible. Insects, unseen but ever present, buzzed a monotonous symphony. Sweat, a constant companion, trickled down Rook's spine, pooling in his boots, mixing with the damp earth smell that clung to everything. He missed the clean, sharp smell of pine trees from his Wisconsin home, the sound of crickets on a cool summer night. Here, the crickets were replaced by the incessant drone of cicadas, a sound so pervasive it became part of the silence, a background hum that threatened to drive a man insane. Elias took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye in the encroaching twilight. He knew Rook was struggling. Every new guy struggled with the waiting. Combat, in its raw, brutal immediacy, at least offered a clear objective, a visceral rush of fight or flight. The waiting, however, was a slow burn, a psychological torture that forced a man to confront his deepest fears in the solitude of his own mind. Rook carefully reassembled his rifle, the familiar clicks and snaps of small, temporary comfort. He ran his hand over the cool, hard plastic of the foregrip, feeling its weight, its potential. It was the only thing that felt real, substantial, in a world that often seemed to dissolve into a haze of heat and paranoia. He glanced towards Elias, catching the sergeant's eye. Elias offered a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden, the unspoken understanding that they were all, in their own way, just taking one breath at a time, perpetually on the precipice of hell, or merely enduring the slow, torturous crawl towards it. The jungle hummed, a predator biding its time. The oppressive stillness of Firebase Alpha was often punctuated only by the mundane sounds of men trying to exist in an impossible environment. Corporal Miller, a lean, wiry Texan with a perpetually cynical smirk, was griping about the Surashans again, his voice a low growl that was almost comforting in its familiarity. Same damn mystery meat for 3 days, Sarge. I swear, the only thing they're not putting in these cans is actual food. Doc Rodriguez, the squad's medic, a quiet man whose hands, usually tending to wounds, now meticulously cleaned his own sidearm, merely grunted in agreement. Doc had a way of observing without comment, his dark eyes missing nothing. Rook, trying to focus on a letter to his mother, found his thoughts drifting, snatched away by the ubiquitous buzzing of flies and the memory of the last time he'd seen a proper meal. He scratched idly at a mosquito bite on his arm, a map of red welts already forming across his exposed skin. He tried to convey the nothingness of his days in his letter, but how could he explain the profound, soul-sapping weight of uneventful hours? It's hot, Mom. Really hot. We're doing okay, just waiting a lot. The words felt hollow, a pale imitation of the truth. He couldn't write about the way the shadows danced at dusk, playing tricks on his eyes, making him jump at every rustle in the undergrowth. He couldn't describe the way the constant, dull ache in his back from sleeping on hard ground had become a permanent resident. He especially couldn't mention the pervasive paranoia that seeped into every pore, painting the jungle as a living, malicious entity, always watching, always judging. Elias, who had been listening to Miller's complaints with half an ear, finally spoke, his voice gravelly. "You want to complain? Miller, go write a letter to the general. Maybe he'll personally fly you in a steak." Miller just snorted, but the tension eased slightly. Doc offered a rare, small smile. Rook found himself observing his squad mates with a new intensity. Miller's sardonic humor was a shield, Doc's quiet competence a steady anchor. Elias, with his stoic patience, was the rock. They were all different facets of the same struggle, each coping with the invisible enemy of anticipation in their own way. He thought about the men he'd left behind in basic, the ones who had washed out, the ones who couldn't handle the simulated stress. He wondered if they knew how lucky they were, spared this slow, insidious erosion of self. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples that seemed impossibly beautiful against the grim reality of their surroundings. As darkness crept in, the jungle sounds shifted. The cicadas gave way to a chorus of unseen creatures, their chirps and clicks taking on a more ominous tone. Every snapping twig, every distant cry was amplified, scrutinized. Rook instinctively reached for his rifle, the cold metal of familiar comfort. He knew he wouldn't sleep well tonight. The waiting would continue, morphing from the dull ache of boredom into the sharp, vigilant agony of night watch, where every shadow held a potential threat, and every rustle could be the one before the storm. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing his mom's face, trying to hold onto the normalcy she represented, a lifeline across an ocean of despair and impending dread. But even that image was beginning to fray at the edges, losing its vibrant color to the monochrome reality of Vietnam. The oppressive quiet of the early afternoon was suddenly shattered by a sound that sent an electric jolt through every man at Firebase Alpha. A Huey, its rotor wash usually a familiar, if deafening, drone came in low, impossibly low, tearing through the air directly above their position. It wasn't on a standard flight path. It was heading straight for their sector, hugging the tree line with an urgency that spoke volumes. The whine of its engine escalated, then abruptly, unervingly, the helicopter banked hard, pulling up sharply before circling back, almost hovering directly over their heads, its door gunners visible, scanning the jungle below with frantic intensity. "Incoming," someone yelled, though no actual rounds had been fired. It was a primal, instinctive reaction. Rook, who had been trying to coax a spark from damp kindling for a pathetic excuse for a fire, dropped everything, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scrambled for his M16, fumbling with the safety, his hands slick with sweat. Men surged from their makeshift shelters, snatching rifles, diving behind sandbags into fighting positions. The carefully constructed facade of mundane waiting evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw, untamed fear. Elias, ever the picture of grim competence, was already barking orders, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Positions, eyes on the tree lean. "Miller, check the wire." Doc Rodriguez, calm even in this whirlwind of adrenaline, moved towards the medevac point, preparing his gear, his face a mask of practiced efficiency. Rook lay prone, his face pressed into the rough sandbags, the smell of damp earth and fear filling his nostrils. His M16 felt impossibly heavy, his breath shallow and ragged. His eyes darted nervously between the hovering Huey and the dense, dark green of the jungle, searching for any sign of movement, any flash of color that didn't belong. He could feel the eyes of unseen enemies on him, their presence almost palpable. The whirring of the helicopter's blades seemed to mock their vulnerability, stirring up dust and debris, a miniature whirlwind of chaos. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying, bargaining, for it not to be real, for it to be a dream. But the thumping in his chest, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, was undeniable. He saw Miller, a few feet away, pressed equally flat, his usual cynicism replaced by a tense, focused dread. Then, as abruptly as it began, the tension deflated. The Huey, after several anxious minutes of circling, dipped its nose, gave one final, low sweep of the perimeter, and then peeled off, disappearing over the distant treeline, its engine noise fading into the oppressive silence it had momentarily shattered. "All clear," Elias yelled, his voice laced with exasperation. "False alarm. Stand down." The relief that flooded Rook was so intense it almost buckled his knees. He stayed motionless for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain from his system, leaving him weak and trembling. He felt a tremor run through his hands, a residual nervous energy that refused to dissipate. Miller let out a long, shaky breath, muttering, "Son of a bitch, they love to mess with us, don't they?" Doc merely shook his head, already putting his gear away. Elias just sighed, a profound, weary sound. Rook, however, felt the full weight of the incident. It wasn't combat, not really, but the adrenaline rush, the near panic had been just as real, just as draining. It was a stark reminder that even in the quiet moments, even when nothing was happening, they were still on the knife's edge. The waiting wasn't just a physical presence. It was a constant, psychological battle, capable of inflicting wounds just as deep as any bullet, leaving scars that festered long after the immediate danger had passed. He cleaned his rifle again, but this time, the repetition offered no solace. The tremor in his hands persisted, a physical manifestation of the invisible war he was fighting within himself. The humid afternoon at Firebase Alpha had barely settled back into its usual monotony when the air crackled with a new, sharper tension. A runner, drenched in sweat and breathing heavily, burst into the squad's area, carrying a sealed, coded message. He saluted Elias, his eyes wide, and handed over the small, folded slip of paper. Elias took it, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the jungle beyond. Rook watched, a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't the usual supply manifest or patrol report. This felt different. Elias unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the ciphered text. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he ran a hand over his stubbled chin. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the men, a silent appraisal. "All right, gather up," he said, his voice low but firm. "Miller, Doc, Rook, everyone." The casual request held an unmistakable gravitas. The men assembled, their usual banter replaced by an expectant silence. Even Miller had shed his cynical persona, his eyes narrowed, anticipating the news. Elias held up the message. Intel reports significant NVA movement in Sector Zulu, approximately 8 clicks west of here. Heavy indications of a resupply route, possibly a staging area. Command wants a recon in force. We're to link up with Bravo Company at grid coordinates X-ray Tango 9 or 4 by 0400 tomorrow. A collective ripple of apprehension went through the small group. Sector Zulu was infamous. It was deep, dense jungle, known for its extensive tunnel complexes and fierce NVA presence. It was the kind of place where recon in force often translated to walk into an ambush. Rook felt a cold dread creep up his spine, but beneath it, a strange, almost perverse sense of relief. The waiting, the psychological torture of endless anticipation was about to end, at least for a while. The enemy, for now, had a face, a location, a concrete threat. Elias unfolded a tattered map, spreading it out on a worn poncho. His finger traced a line through a maze of contour lines and dense green markings. We're heading out before first light. Objective: confirm NVA presence, identify the extent of their operations, and engage if tactically advantageous. Rule of engagement: fire superiority. No unnecessary risks, but if they show, we hit him hard. He began assigning roles, his voice calm and methodical. Miller, your point. Watch for booby traps, tripwires, anything out of place. Doc, you're with me. Rook, you'll be on rear security. Keep your eyes peeled. Listen for anything behind us. Rook nodded, tried to absorb the instructions, his mind racing. He checked his gear, his M16, his magazines, his canteen. Every item felt heavier now, imbued with a new purpose. The abstract threat of the enemy had suddenly become a tangible, specific destination. He felt the fear, a cold, clenching fist in his gut, but it was a different kind of fear than the one that came with endless waiting. This was the fear of impending action, of the known unknown, which, paradoxically, felt more manageable than the boundless terror of what if. Elias looked at each man in turn, his gaze holding theirs for a moment. Get some rest, boys. Top off water, check your gear. We're going into bad country. Stay sharp, stay alive. The words hung in the humid air, a stark reminder of the stakes. Rook lay on his bunk, unable to sleep, the sound of the jungle no longer vague background noise, but a specific, almost prophetic murmur. The silent war of waiting was over. The loud one was about to begin. The jungle swallowed them whole as they slipped past the wire of Firebase Alpha before the first hint of dawn. The air was a thick, humid blanket, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the faint metallic tang of fear. The sliver of moon offered scant illumination, turning the familiar path into a treacherous maze of shadows and indistinct shapes. Miller, lean and silent, led the way, his M16 held at the ready, his eyes scanning the undergrowth with practiced ease. Each step was a calculated risk, a deliberate placement of weight to avoid snapping a twig, to avoid disturbing the myriad unseen creatures that called this dense labyrinth home. Rook, walking point as rear security, focused intently on Elias's boots ahead of him, trying to mimic the sergeant's almost preternatural grace. The weight of his rucksack, heavy with ammunition, water, and the sparse necessities for a multi-day patrol, dug into his shoulders, a constant, dull ache. Sweat began to bead on his forehead almost immediately, mixing with the ever-present humidity, making his uniform cling uncomfortably to his skin. The jungle was a living, breathing entity, its sounds magnified in the pre-dawn quiet. The insistent buzz of unseen insects, the distant cry of a night bird, the rustle of leaves that could be a squirrel or something far more deadly. Every sound was scrutinized, every shadow held a potential threat. Rook's senses were on high alert, hyper-focused, his hearing picking up minute changes in the jungle's symphony, his eyes straining to discern patterns in the chaotic foliage. They moved through triple-canopied jungle, a dark, oppressive ceiling of interwoven branches and vines that filtered out all but the faintest shafts of sunlight. The ground beneath their boots was a treacherous mix of slick mud, hidden roots, and sharp, thorny plants that clawed at their uniforms. Leeches were a constant menace, clinging to any exposed skin, their presence a grotesque reminder of the jungle's hostile embrace. Rook found himself mentally chanting a rhythm with his steps, a desperate attempt to maintain focus, to keep the insidious thoughts of what lay ahead at bay. One step, another. Breathe in, breathe out. Listen, watch. The fear was a cold, constant companion, but it was different from the anxious dread of waiting. This was a more immediate, visceral fear, a primal instinct to survive, to remain undetected, to move through this hostile environment without becoming another statistic. He remembered Elias's words from the briefing. Bad country. This was it. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, every fleeting shadow seemed to whisper the same warning. He kept his rifle pointed downwards, ready to bring it up in an instant, his finger hovering near the trigger guard. He scanned the trees behind them, then the flanks, then ahead, trying to cover every angle to be aware of every potential ambush point. The constant movement, the physical exertion became a strange kind of meditation, a way to channel the adrenaline and fear into productive vigilance. They had been moving for hours, the sun now a searing presence above the canopy, turning the air into a steamy oven. Their progress was agonizingly slow, each kilometer feeling like 10. Deeper into Sector Zulu, The jungle seemed to grow even denser, the silence more profound, more menacing. Rook glanced at Elias, who was ahead, his face impassive, his eyes like steel. The sergeant carried the weight of their lives, and Rook, in that moment, felt a profound trust in his leadership. They were a small, vulnerable unit, venturing into the heart of darkness, one breath at a time. Each step bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation, closer to the unknown horrors that awaited them in the suffocating embrace of the jungle. After hours of agonizingly slow movement, the patrol reached a small, almost imperceptible clearing, a natural choke point along a barely discernible game trail. The air here felt different, heavy, still. The usual symphony of jungle sounds, the chirping of unseen insects, the distant calls of birds, had abruptly ceased, replaced by a profound, almost suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that screamed danger. Elias, who had been moving with the fluidity of a predator, raised a gloved hand, signaling a halt. Every man froze, instantly melting into the surrounding foliage, becoming one with the shadows. Rook dropped to one knee, his M16 up, safety off, his heart thumping against his ribs like a drum. He tried to control his breathing, to slow the frantic pace, to calm the sudden tremor in his hands. The jungle, moments ago a vibrant, teeming ecosystem, now felt like a vast, empty tomb, holding its breath, waiting. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a loud, intrusive roar that threatened to drown out any external sound. His eyes darted nervously, scanning every inch of the clearing, every clump of dense vegetation, every gnarled tree trunk. He looked at Elias, who was a few yards ahead, crouched low, his head cocked slightly, his eyes narrowed to slits, his mouth slightly ajar as he listened, straining to catch the faintest whisper of movement, the most subtle shift in the air. The sergeant's intense focus was a beacon of grim determination, a testament to years of experience in this deadly environment. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second feeling like an eternity. Rook felt the trickle of sweat down his back, cold now despite the heat, a testament to his rising fear. He remembered the false alarm at Firebase Alpha, the sickening rush of adrenaline followed by the deflating relief. This felt different. There was no Huey circling overhead, no distant radio chatter, just the profound, absolute silence, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart. He tried to think, to analyze, to identify a specific threat, but his mind was a blur of heightened senses and primal fear. He could smell the damp earth, the decay, the faint, acrid scent of something foreign in the air. He could feel the tiny insects crawling on his skin, but he ignored them, his entire being focused on the immediate, unseen threat. He saw Elias slowly, almost imperceptibly, raise his M16, pointing it toward a particularly dense thicket to their left. The movement was so subtle, so deliberate, it conveyed more warning than any shout. Rook followed his gaze, his rifle instinctively coming up, aligning with the sergeant's target. He held his breath, straining his ears, trying to pierce the veil of silence. Then he heard it, a faint click, so faint, so delicate, it was almost imagined, a sound barely louder than a beetle scuttling across a leaf, yet in the oppressive stillness, it resonated like a thunderclap. It was the unmistakable sound of tripwire being disturbed, the metallic whisper of a firing pin activating, the promise of instant, horrific violence. His blood ran cold, the one breath from hell moment. He squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, a silent, desperate prayer escaping his lips before snapping them open, his finger already tightening on the trigger, bracing for the inevitable eruption of chaos. The faint click was instantly swallowed by a deafening roar. A claymore mine, rigged with malicious precision, detonated directly in front of the thicket Elias had targeted, sending a searing wave of shrapnel and dirt through the air. Before the echoes could fully dissipate, hell itself broke loose. Automatic rifle fire erupted from 3 distinct positions, crisscrossing the clearing in a deadly, relentless torrent. Tracer rounds, like angry red wasps, stitched through the air, carving arcs of death. Rook was thrown violently to the ground by the concussive force of the explosion, his ears ringing, disoriented and gasping for breath. The world dissolved into a chaotic maelstrom of noise, motion, and visceral horror. He heard screams, the guttural shouts of NVA soldiers, the frantic cries of his own men. His training, honed through countless hours of repetition, kicked in, overriding the primal fear. He rolled onto his stomach, raising his M16, aiming blindly at the muzzle flashes that blinked like malevolent eyes from the dense foliage. He squeezed a trigger, a short, controlled burst, feeling the recoil against his shoulder, hearing the sharp crack of his own weapon adding to the cacophony. Through the haze of dirt and smoke, he saw Miller go down, a sickening thud, his body crumpling like a discarded rag doll. Doc Rodriguez, his face a mask of grim determination, was already scrambling towards him, ignoring the hail of bullets, his medic bag clutched in one hand. Elias was a blur of controlled violence, his M16 spitting fire in rhythmic bursts, his voice a roaring torrent of commands, cutting through the chaos. Return fire. Suppressing fire. Don't let him flank. Rook focused, pushing aside the fear, the nausea, the ringing in his ears. He aimed at a specific flash, then another, emptying a magazine in what felt like seconds. He fumbled for a fresh one, his fingers slick with sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would explode through his chest. He chambered around, the metallic snap a sharp punctuation mark in the symphony of destruction, and continued firing. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burning leaves, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet, the smell of fresh blood. He saw an NBA soldier emerge briefly from the treeline, a shadowy figure with a rifle, and Rook fired, a burst that stitched across the man's chest. The figure stumbled, then fell, disappearing back into the jungle. There was no time for thought, no time for reflection, only reaction, survival. He heard Doc yelling something, his voice strained, urgent. Miller's hit bad. Need cover. Elias, already aware, shifted his fire, laying down a heavier barrage towards the NVA position closest to document Rook joined in, aiming a burst towards the source of enemy fire, trying to draw their attention, to buy Doc precious seconds. The firefight, a brutal, intense ballet of death, felt like an eternity, yet was over in a matter of minutes. The NVA, having unleashed their ambush, melted back into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared, their automatic fire tapering off, then ceasing altogether. The silence that followed was deafening, a ringing, echoing void that seemed to suck all sound, all light, all hope from the world. Rook lay prone, his body shaking uncontrollably, his rifle still pointed towards the empty jungle. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred. He was alive, but the silence after the storm was almost more terrifying than the combat itself. A stark, brutal reminder of what had just transpired and what might still be lurking just beyond the edge of their immediate perception. The ringing silence that followed the abrupt cessation of gunfire was a physical assault, a vacuum where a moment ago there had been chaos. Rook lay gasping, his face pressed against the damp earth, the smell of cordite and fresh-turned soil filling his nostrils. His body trembled uncontrollably, a violent, involuntary tremor that made his teeth chatter. The adrenaline, which had surged through him like a wildfire, now receded, leaving him weak and nauseated. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his vision slowly clearing, the world refocusing into grim reality. The clearing was a churned mess of disturbed earth, shredded leaves, and the lingering haze of smoke. His eyes immediately sought out Miller. Doc Rodriguez was hunched over him, his hands working frantically, his face pale beneath the grime and sweat. Miller lay unnaturally still, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. "Doc!" Rook croaked, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable. Doc didn't answer, his concentration absolute, his whispered medical instructions the only sound breaking the awful silence. Elias, ever vigilant, was already on his feet, moving with swift purpose, M16 at the ready, sweeping the perimeter, his eyes like steel, searching for any sign of a lingering enemy, a follow-up attack. He moved like a ghost, a silhouette against the hazy light filtering through the canopy, a grim sentinel in the immediate aftermath of hell. "Miller, how bad, Doc?" Elias's voice was low, strained, the first true crack in his stoic facade. Doc finally looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's. His voice was grim, weary. "He took a round, Sarge, right in the chest, through and through. I'm stopping the bleed, but it's bad." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Rook felt a cold, hard-knot form in his stomach. Miller, with his cynical jokes and his endless complaints, had been a constant, a familiar part of this impossible existence. Now he was just another statistic, another casualty of the unseen enemy. Rook's gaze drifted beyond Miller and Doc to where the claymore had detonated. He saw the disturbed earth, the shredded vegetation, and then, lying twisted amidst the debris, an NVA soldier. He was young, impossibly young, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the canopy. A discarded AK-47 lay near his outstretched hand. The reality of what had just happened, the brutal, visceral finality of it, hit Rook like a physical blow. This wasn't training. This wasn't a drill. These were real men on both sides, and some of them were now irrevocably broken or dead. The smell of blood, faint but distinct, mingled with the cordite and the jungle rot, an unbearable stench that he knew would forever be etched into his memory. Elias returned from his perimeter check, his face grim. "No movement. They pulled back, but we can't linger. Doc, get him stabilized. Rook, secure the immediate area. Miller, you still with us?" Miller groaned a low, pain-filled sound, but he didn't answer. Doc continued to work, his movements efficient despite the urgency. Rook, still shaking, forced himself to move, to check the immediate vicinity for any remaining threats, any booby traps, any signs of the enemy. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking danger, every rustle of leaves amplified into a potential threat. He cleaned his rifle again, but this time, the repetition offered no solace. The tremor in his hands persisted, a physical manifestation of the invisible war he was fighting within himself. He glanced back at Miller, at Doc working feverishly, and then at Elias, who stood over them, a silent, watchful guardian. The combat might have ended, but the true battle, the struggle for survival, the processing of the horror, had only just begun. The jungle, which had been a silent observer, now felt like a hungry maw, ready to consume them whole. The journey back to Firebase Alpha was an agonizing, torturous crawl, a stark contrast to the breathless rush of the ambush. The jungle, which had felt menacing before, now seemed actively hostile, every shadow a potential sniper, every rustle a hidden threat. The relative safety of the Firebase felt impossibly distant, a mirage beyond an endless green hell. They had improvised a stretcher for Miller, using 2 rifles and a poncho, and the task of carrying him fell primarily to Rook and another soldier, Private Johnson, a quiet, older man who rarely spoke. Every step was a profound effort. Miller, though sedated by Doc, groaned sporadically, each sound a painful reminder of his injury, of the cost of their mission. Rook felt the weight of his comrade's body, the desperate fragility of human life, pressing down on him, physically and emotionally. His own body screamed in protest, his muscles aching, his lungs burning, but he pushed through, driven by a grim determination. Doc Rodriguez walked alongside the stretcher, his eyes constantly on Miller, administering fluids, checking bandages, a tireless guardian. His face was a mask of grim concentration, smudged with dirt and sweat, his movements efficient despite the immense pressure. Elias, always watchful, took point on the return journey, his M16 held at the low ready, his gaze constantly sweeping the surrounding jungle. He moved with a silent, heavy determination, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling current of fear and exhaustion. Rook glanced at him occasionally, seeing the lines of fatigue etched deeper into the sergeant's face, the unspoken burden of leadership weighing heavily on his shoulders. The jungle itself seemed to mock their struggle. The oppressive heat beat down, baking the humidity into a suffocating blanket. The insects, relentless and omnipresent, found every exposed patch of skin. The tangled undergrowth, once merely an obstacle, now felt like a deliberate barrier designed to impede their progress, to keep them trapped. Each snapped twig, each distant bird call, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Rook. The paranoia was intense, a sharpened knife twisting in his gut. Was that a shadow moving? Was that a faint human sound amidst the jungle's cacophony? Every sense was on high alert, but the fatigue blurred the edges of perception, making it difficult to distinguish real threats from phantom ones. They moved in silence, a heavy, communal silence, broken only by the slosh of mud underfoot, the labored breathing of the men, and Miller's occasional, pained groans. There was no banter, no casual conversation, only the shared burden of their survival, the silent understanding of the hell they had just endured, and the lingering threat of more to come. Rook's mind replayed moments from the ambush, the flashes of muzzle fire, the screams, the sight of Miller falling. The images were burned into his memory, vivid and horrifying. He felt a profound exhaustion, not just physical, but soul deep, a weariness that seeped into his bones and threatened to consume him. This wasn't the slow, insidious drain of waiting. This was the raw, brutal aftermath of combat, leaving behind a hollow ache where his innocence once resided. As the distant, familiar drone of a Huey medevac finally grew louder, a wave of relief, so potent it almost brought him to his knees, washed over Rook. They weren't safe yet, not truly, but they were closer. The jungle, however, had left its mark. The journey back was more than just a physical trek. It was a passage through the landscape of his own shattered perceptions, a stark reminder that even if his body made it out, a part of him would forever remain trapped in the suffocating embrace of that dense, unforgiving green. The return to Firebase Alpha, under the pale glow of a resupply Huey's landing lights, felt utterly surreal. The relative safety of the sandbag perimeter and the familiar hum of the generators was alien, detached from the visceral terror they had just escaped. Miller was immediately whisked away by the medevac crew, his face pale and still, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. Doc Rodriguez simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his efforts, before collapsing onto an ammo crate, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. Elias, after debriefing a junior officer, returned to his squad, his face etched with a fatigue that seemed to go bone deep. He simply nodded at Rook and Johnson, a silent commendation, before heading towards his own bunk, the burden of their ordeal visibly weighing on him. Rook found himself sitting on his bunk, his gear discarded around him, his M16 leaning against the makeshift wall. He started to clean it out of habit, but his hands, though no longer trembling violently, moved slowly, mechanically. The familiar routine, once a source of comfort during the endless waiting, now felt hollow, an empty gesture. The silence of the firebase, usually a monotonous drone of distant artillery and buzzing insects, now seemed impossibly loud, filled with the echoes of gunfire, screams, and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He tried to think, to process the events of the last 24 hours, but his mind refused to cooperate, cycling through fragmented images. Miller's fall, the young NVA soldier's vacant eyes, the taste of fear, the smell of blood. The jungle outside the wire, once an abstract threat, was now a vivid, terrifying memory. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was an experience, a living, breathing entity that had almost consumed him. He realized that the waiting, the endless, grinding anticipation had been transformed. It was no longer a vague, shapeless dread. It was now sharpened, edged with the knowledge of what lurked just beyond the wire, what a moment of quiet could truly signify. He had faced the hell of combat and survived, but the survival had come at a cost. The innocence that had dulled the edge of his fear during the initial period of waiting was gone, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. He looked at his hands, grime ingrained under his fingernails, dried mud clinging to his skin. They felt different, older, capable of both violence and trembling. The war wasn't just out there in the jungle. It was inside him now, a seed planted by the ambush, nurtured by the trauma. He wouldn't look at a patch of dense foliage the same way, wouldn't hear a distant crackle of branches without his muscles tensing, wouldn't experience silence without expecting it to shatter. The true war, he understood now, was not just about the fighting. It was about what the fighting did to you and what the waiting built up only for a single, brutal moment to tear down. He lay back on his bunk, staring up at the corrugated tin roof, the faint light of a bare bulb casting long, dancing shadows. He had taken one breath from hell, and he had returned, but the echoes of that breath would linger forever, shaping every future moment of quiet, every future moment of anticipation. The cycle would begin again, the waiting for the next encounter, the next moment of terror. But this time, he would wait with the knowledge of what lay ahead, forever changed by the brutal, unforgettable truth of the jungle.